Hello and welcome to the Scottish Sun's General Election podcast. My name's Conor Matchett. I'm the political editor at the paper, and here with me today, as always, is Chris Musson, associate editor, Brackets Politics.
Important brackets.
Critical brackets. We're imposing a 10-minute rule on this podcast over the next week, at the very minimum, probably forever. So here it goes. Here we're starting it. Bang. So, big week ahead in the election.
Just a bit.
And we've had the war of the battle buses straight off today.
So, today, Friday, we've got Labour launching, Labour have already launched their battle bus, but they're out with two battle buses today. And that's Sarah's battle bus and Angela Rayner's battle bus.
So weird meeting kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. A weird bus mating thing going on there, I think. And we've got the SNP launching their battle bus today, and they're sort of snaking around the sort of south of Scotland. We've been mapping it out this morning, praying that they were going to cross paths, but we don't think they are.
They kind of gently shave each other, don't they, at East Kilbride, and that's about it. Yeah,
they'll be passing each other in time, sort of like Doctor Who, a bad episode of Doctor Who, but they'll never actually be together as one. So that's the day. And then we've got the Lib Dems who, are trying to sort of trump everyone during this campaign with their wackiness and crazy photo calls. Ed Davey's actually going to go from John O'Groats to Land's End next week, and beating everybody. I mean, that's fantastic. Sounds pretty fantastic.
We were thinking about it this earlier because we were thinking, kind of hoping for them to meet at some McDonald's takeaway, trying to work out exactly what each party would buy. So we were thinking the SNP, anything with like a muck in it, just to be on brand.
It's lazy, anti-Scottish.
Hideous from both of us. And then Labour, we were thinking, I think Angela Rayner's a chicken McNuggets girl.
Possibly. I reckon she'd like polish off 3 or 4 Big Macs, then just chuck the boxes at whoever's sort of in a line of fire.
And Sir Ed Davies just going through to Costa because he's a posh man.
Exactly. Yeah.
But do you think this will make any difference? This campaign, we've got a week to go. It's a big push for a lot of them. John Swinney's making a big deal of this. He's going to visit as much as he can in the next week as he tries to get that SNP message across. But is it going to shift anything?
Well, it might not shift the overall polling numbers, but what it might do is seeing the presence in the communities. It might actually get people out, and that's going to become a really big battle over the next week, is these parties actually getting their core votes out. So not necessarily shifting the dial in terms of the polls, but mobilising their voters, and that's going to be absolutely crucial for the SNP and for Labour, given the fine margins.
Yeah, and let's talk about the polls, because we had a couple out yesterday from a couple of pollsters, Salvation and Savannah. We had Labour on 37%, the SNP on 31% when it came to the Salvation poll, and then we also had them on 34% each when it came to the Savannah poll. Tell us kind of what you think of those poll figures as they kind of sit.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Scotland, we've not had, there's polls every day in the rest of the UK and sort of like England polls, but in Scotland, we've not had that many polls. I think we've had maybe 10 since the start of the campaign, and they're averaging out at Labour having a sort of 3-4 point lead over the SNP, maybe slightly smaller if you look at the last few polls. So there is quite a range in the polls. As you said, there's 2 polls this week. One gave Labour a 6-point lead, the other put Labour and the SNP on exactly the same. So we're talking really fine margins here. And you get to a point where if Labour do get 3 or 4 points ahead, it starts tipping and they start cashing in with loads of seats. But if it is more like where Savannah put them, it's going to be a lot tighter. And I think, some of the talk of huge kind of Labour Scottish landslide in terms of many, many more seats in the SNP is a bit premature at the moment. It could well end up that way, but there are lots of moving parts and very fine margins.
Yeah, there's a few seat projections from these 2 polls. The Salvation poll, we predicted Labour on 31 MPs, the SNP on 17, Lib Dems on 5, Tories on 4, whereas the Savannah poll had Labour on 28, the SNP on 18, 6 for the Conservatives and 5 for the Lib Dems. Both results, personally, I think that the SNP would probably be pretty happy with compared to where they might have been earlier on in the campaign.
Yeah, big style. And following the Rutherglen by-election back in October, that huge swing to Labour, there are a lot of fears in the SNP in the intervening period that things are going to be absolutely catastrophic. They could sink to sort of below 10 or something like that. I don't think that's going to happen. It's still possible it's going to happen. I'm just hedging my bets here, but I don't think at this stage. I don't think it's going to be that bad for Labour and sorry for the SNP, and the SNP will couch anything. Labour getting anything less than 30 seats is like a disappointing night for Labour.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's briefly chat about the Conservative picture in Scotland, because one of the things that we kind of noticed in the Savannah poll is the impact of reform. Now, pollsters sometimes don't prompt smaller parties because they don't think it thinks that it overstates their support. But reform was prompted in the Savannah poll for the first time, and we saw Labour's support in that poll drop. There's an interesting tactical / protest vote going on potentially among 2019 Tory voters in Scotland who are looking at reform and going, do you know what, we'll back them even though we don't want the Nats to win.
No, big style. And there's a big worry in the Tories at the moment that this reform thing, which has come out of absolutely nowhere in Scotland, is going to really badly impact them, because there's very, very tight margins on some of those northeast seats that the Tories are trying to defend or win. And, they were hoping to pick up seats like Central Ayrshire and stuff like that, but this is going to be made all the more difficult by this growing reform vote, because
they'll struggle to hold on to the northeast seats, won't they, the Tories? With a few hundred votes to reform, that's that seat lost.
Absolutely. I mean, it's this battle of whose vote falls the slowest between the SNP and the Tories, and this reform element is definitely risking speeding up the Tory vote falling. And we've seen it this week how spooked they are. Another rival paper, won't name it, but it rhymes with the Daily Snail. They have splashed various times, haven't they, on this reform threat? And don't vote reform. It's handing a gift to the SNP. So they are obviously really spooked.
Absolutely. And the other thing that we've had in the last week is the last, thank God, TV debate when it came to Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer facing off in Nottingham, hosted by Michelle Hussain on the BBC. It's the last of those, and actually I think possibly only the second kind of head-to-head debate between the two of them since the start of the campaign. Personally, I think we've had so many that these supposed possible dial shifters become just part and parcel. But do you think it made an impact? How do you think Keir Starmer did? How do you think Rishi Sunak did?
Well, I mean, we go from the point of view. I'm very, very cynical about these debates. I wrote a column on it the other week where I was like in a mad rant about how,
doesn't sound like you,
who won this debate? Well, who won this debate is the person you liked most before won the debate. Funnily enough, from your point of view, it's utterly futile trying to say who won it. You could have a clapometer at somewhere in the room, but you'd have to make sure that the audience was perfectly balanced and the clapometer was pointing in the right direction and blah, blah, blah. It's utterly futile. But all that said, that debate that we had this week was actually the best of the lot, I think, in terms of sheer drama, and they really kind of got going, and I think they really got to the swing of it. But Keir Starmer had a really tough time.
Particularly on immigration, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's one of these topics which obviously gets those who care about it going the most. Yeah. And he was getting a tough time from the studio audience on that. And Sunak was much more polished as a politician, and Starmer looked quite spooked at points. That said, he was very, very steady. There were no catastrophic errors, and that is been the whole idea of his and Labour's entire campaign. Just don't do anything catastrophically wrong.
And as well, Rishi Sunak realistically needed to be, beating Sir Keir Starmer comfortably in every single debate that he's been in since the start of the campaign to make any sort of difference in the polls. And he's come out, initially clearly losing. Yeah. Arguably this week, I think that we gave them both 7 out of 10 because it was a better performance from both of them. But he's not beating the Labour leader, is he? He's not making any ground.
And therefore, fundamentally, I don't think it's shifting the dial, and I don't think these debates will have made the blindest bit of difference, though they've given a lot of journalists a lot of late nights.
Yeah, a lot of copy to write. We've got less than a week to go now until polling day. Obviously, we'll get results day in a week today, next Friday. That'll be when we know where all of the Parliament sits, how many MPs we'll have of all the various different parties. What can we expect in the next week, do you think, from each of the different parties in Scotland?
So the SNP are just going to be going on about Brexit, about austerity, about how Scotland needs independence to solve all these things, and they'll be also going on about cuts that are coming under the Tories or Labour, regardless. Labour, they are going to be basically saying change. It's worked for them so far. There's no reason to.
Ironically, they won't change the process.
Precisely. Why change the record? That's all you'll hear next week when there's change. And then the Tories in Scotland are going to be talking about sending a message to the SNP, because they are focused, remember, on those seats where they are doing battle with the SNP. So they're going to be talking about the SNP incessantly.
Perfect timing. There we go.
Fancy that.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's it. That's all we've got time for the Scottish Sun's General Election podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.